So the last way to solve a quadratic is to solve it by this square root property. So one way that we will know that we're going to need to do this is because one, it will look completely different than the other quadratic equations that we've had so far, because we'll more than likely see these parentheses. Okay, so when we see this, we're going to isolate those parentheses, meaning we're going to move anything else to the other side. We'll take the square root, hence the square root property, and then we'll begin to solve from there. All right, so let's look at an example here, and I think it'll make a little bit more sense. All right, let's say that we have x plus 5 squared minus 6 equals 12. Right, so if you look at this one, it immediately looks different than the others because I have this set of parentheses. I have an entire term being squared. All right, so instead, the other ones, we were supposed to be setting it equal to 0. However, here we're going to isolate our term. So I need to get anything that is not inside those parentheses to the other side. So I need to get rid of this minus 6. I'm going to add it. Add it to both sides. So I'm going to be x plus 5 squared equals 18. Now that that is by itself, that squared term, or that parentheses, I'm going to now take the square root of both sides. Okay. So when I take the square root of something squared, it just crosses off that squared. So it would leave me with just the x plus 5. When I take the square root of 18, it does two things. First thing it does is it gives me a plus minus in front of that, because I could have positive numbers or negative numbers when I take the square root. And then what it does is it forces me to take the square root, possibly having to go simplify, which in this case I do. So we're going to take the square root of 18, which we're going to simplify to be 9 times 2, which is 3 times 3. So I would have 3 square roots of 2. So once I simplify it, I'm going to bring it back. So I have x plus 5 equals plus or minus 3 square roots of 2. Now I'm going to finish solving. So if you think about how can I get x by itself, I would need to subtract a 5. Now if we think back to the quadratic formula, remember we had some number plus or minus and then some square root. That's exactly what this is now going to look like, because I'm going to have that negative 5 plus or minus 3 square roots of 2. So in the end, these square root properties almost look like a quadratic formula in the end. Okay, let's look at another example, make sure that we really got it. Okay, so let's say we have 2 parentheses x plus 1 squared minus 8 equals 10, right? So in this case, we see that we've got this squared expression here. So I need to, instead of setting it to 0, I'm going to isolate that set of parentheses. So I need to get rid of the 8 and the 2. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add that 8 to the other side. Then I'm going to go ahead and divide by that 2. So I'm going to have x plus 1 squared equals 9. Now that that squared term is isolated, I'm going to take my square root. Remember, when I take the square root, I can cross off that square part. And I'm going to get a plus and a minus of this squared term, of this square root now. Square root of 9, I don't even need to take that over to the side. I know that the square root of 9 is 3. But it's not just 3, it's plus and minus 3. Okay, so be careful with that. Now I need to finish solving. So I'm going to subtract 1 here. Okay, so I've got x equals negative 1 plus or minus 3. Now, that's kind of weird. It doesn't have a square root anymore, so I'm actually not done. I wouldn't say, oh, I have $1 plus $3. I would just say I have $4, right? So the same thing here. I'm not going to say I have -1 plus 3. We're just going to go ahead and find those two numbers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, and I'm going to say -1 plus 3, which would give me 2. And I'm going to say -1 minus 3, which is -4. So I'm going to get my two solutions by actually adding and subtracting that 3 to my number, okay? So sometimes when I take the square root, using the square root property, it would look like the first one did, more of like the quadratic formula. Sometimes in the end, it'll look more like a factored answer, like in the second one where I actually have two numbers versus I still have that square root left over.